On the last perfect day, Astinus said, his voice shaking, the three gods will come together. Paladin in his radiance, Queen Takesis in her darkness, and lastly, Gillian, Lord of Neutrality. In their hands, each bears the key of knowledge. They will place these keys upon the great altar, and upon the altar will also be placed my books, the story of every being who has lived upon Krynn throughout time. Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe. Today's video, as you may have guessed, is about Astinus, the librarian of Palanthas, the most mysterious figure in Dragonlance's history. Or at least, he's supposed to be. The reality is that the authors have never confirmed what many fans suspect. They must know that we know that Astinus is really Gillian. Now, how does this work is what some may wonder. Others may not think too deeply about it. Let's actually delve into it a little, shall we? Astinus appeared early in Palanthas' history, in the Age of Dreams. The year was 1772 pre-Cataclysm. The Great Library had just been completed when Astinus appeared and immediately took over Master of the Library. He then recruited a number of sages and aesthetics, basically monks for all intents and purposes, to work for him. Many of them formed the Order of Aesthetics, and the library became, in all the aids of Astinus, essentially the Church of Gillian. And this church is very different from the other churches. First off, in the mortal realm, Astinus fulfills the duty of Grand Historian of Krynn. It is, in many cases, throughout the stories of Dragonlance, there is a bit of a tale being told within the tale, with Astinus recounting many of the great wonders and tales through his great tomes, in a way. Well, he's actually copying it down, just as the story is taking place, or after it has long since taken place, so that we're not seeing the actual events in some cases unfolding, but rather Astinus seeing it happen. The Church of Gillian technically did not disappear from Krynn with the downfall of Istar. Doubtlessly, Gillian was as angry as the other gods, but he kept on working on his books. What is noteworthy is that the gods of magic didn't disappear. Now, how does this avatar ship work? Well, this is a good question. Doubtlessly, we have to consider the metaphysical similarities in some ways of Olorin taking on the shape of what we call Gandalf over in Lord of the Rings. There are differences, certainly. Gillian's a greater god rather than a lesser spirit. Gillian has become enmeshed in creation, and yet a part of him probably remains separate. This separate part functions as the god Gillian, but the incarnate part has become rather enmeshed and is weaker than the god Gillian himself naturally is, and that as the ages are progressing, he is weakening in some ways, or at least becoming more and more immortal in key ways, rather akin to Gandalf or even Sauron. And it is entirely possible, if we go down that line of thought, that Gillian's ring of sorts is the library of Palanthas. He has not poured his essence into the world of Krynn as Morgoth did with Arda, but rather the library and the books within his library, so that they are essentially his ring. At least that would be my theory. A possibility, really. Although I'm not sure of that one. I think he is partly separate, but partly incarnated. Do more reading of the nature of Middle-earth and Morgoth's ring. And the reason I'm turning to those tomes is because it could be relevant here. Unless, of course, the authors, such as Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, suddenly develop an interest in the metaphysics of Krynn, at which point we'll have to defer to their wisdom and opinion of the nature of Gillian. What does this mean for Astinus? Is he immortal or not? Yes, he is, so long as Krynn exists. But when that last perfect day that he talks about in Dragons of Spring Dawning comes up, he will cease to be mortal. He will essentially refuse himself with his divine essence, so to speak. What this roughly means is that you have Gillian upholding the balance, but also noting down the history of Krynn. So, pretty complex ideas there. Is Astinus all-knowing? It does not appear that he is up until Feast on Tantalus, then later Raistlин's visit. So if he is the avatar of Gillian, he's rather cut off from Gillian's all-knowing nature. Why did Gillian incarnate? It could be that Gillian saw fit that the world would need knowledge. It would need to remember its true history. Not the history Takhisis would want the people of Krynn to know, which is really not knowledge or truth. It's her blatant lies. Nor did he likely think that people would fully believe what Paladin has to say, as the King Priest of Istar seems to have turned against Paladin's decrees and ideals and perverted them from within, so that the King Priest of Istar really has more in common with Galen Dracos than he does, say, Chrysania or Goldmoon, the main followers of Paladin, and Mishakal, I guess you could also say, given Goldmoon primarily worships Mishakal, in the original era. So we've explored the why, we've explored a bit of the how, but there remains the question of what do the other gods think of this? What does Paladin think of it? Likely, he does not think over much of it. He probably has his own duties that he has to see to. But it would be interesting if in Dragons of Deceit we were to see Fizban encounter Astinus. The two would doubtlessly recognize each other to an extent. We have to bear in mind that Fizban is enmeshed in creation. He is the incarnate shape of Paladin. He can be harmed, he can be subdued, and that could actually physically harm Paladin. Just as when Takhisis incarnated herself at the end of the Legend of Huma, she was injured and could have well have died. What will happen should any of these three incarnations actually perish? I will propose that it's rather like when Morgoth or Sauron are to perish, or Saruman, in Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, respectively, in that Takhisis' physical shape will perish. She'll be as a shadow, observing but never able to influence. And thus, it would be a terrible blow in a way to the balance. She still exists, but as a shadow. Same thing would happen with Paladin. And I imagine the same thing would happen to Astinus, should he ever die. Though the fact that Palanthas has never been truly threatened is worth noting. Save once, it does beg the question, what would happen? As the upholder of balance, Gillian plays a key role, and likely it would be a terrible blow to Krynn if he were to be slain and become a shadow of his former self, never able to influence or communicate his will to others. Likely this would have dire repercussions. All of the world would fly out of control, as Gillian is truly the scales weighing each side, darkness and light, and keeping the two level with each other. Now, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to smash that like and that subscribe button like it's a spider and you're smashing it with a good, fat, voluminous book.